Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried down the cobblestone path. The October wind cut through the fabric like ice, and she could hear her children's teeth chattering behind her. Emma, her 7-year-old daughter, clutched her hand with fingers that felt like frozen twigs, while 10-year-old Thomas trudged alongside them, his worn shoes barely holding together. The gas lamps flickered weakly in the growing darkness, casting dancing shadows that made Margaret's heart race. She shouldn't be out this late with the children, but the landlord had given her until midnight to pay the rent or face eviction. 3 months of late payments had exhausted his patience, and Margaret's job at the textile mill barely covered food, let alone housing. "Mama, I'm cold," Emma whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "I know, sweetheart. We're almost home," Margaret lied, knowing they had nowhere warm to go. The boarding house would be locked to them by morning if she couldn't find the money tonight. Thomas stopped walking suddenly. "Mama, look!" Margaret followed her son's gaze to see a tall figure standing beneath the broken street lamp ahead. The man wore an expensive black coat that seemed untouched by the wind, and his dark hair was perfectly styled despite the weather. As they approached, Margaret noticed his pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight, and his eyes held an unusual depth that made her stomach flutter with unease. "Good evening," the stranger said, his voice smooth as silk. "Forgive me for startling you, but I couldn't help noticing you and your children seemed distressed." Margaret instinctively pulled Emma closer. "We're fine, thank you." The man stepped forward, and Margaret caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something she couldn't identify. "My name is Adrian Blackwood. I live in the manor house on Hillcrest Avenue, Escus." He gestured toward the wealthy district across town. "I was returning from business when I saw you." "We don't need charity," Margaret said quickly, though her voice betrayed her desperation. Adrian studied her face in the lamplight. Her cheekbones were sharp from hunger, and dark circles shadowed her green eyes. The children pressed against her sides like small birds seeking shelter. "What's your name?" "Margaret Sullivan." The words slipped out before she could stop them. "Margaret," Adrian repeated, as if tasting the name. "How long since your husband passed?" Margaret's eyes widened. She hadn't mentioned being a widow, yet somehow this stranger knew. 8 months, she whispered. "The consumption?" She nodded, unable to speak. David's illness had drained their savings, leaving her with nothing but debts and 2 hungry children. Adrian reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Sullivan." He pulled out several crisp bills that represented more money than Margaret had seen in months. "My estate requires a housekeeper. The position includes lodging for you and your children, meals, and a generous salary." Margaret stared at the money, her mind reeling. "I don't understand." "You don't know me. Why would you—" "Call it intuition," Adrian said, his lips curving into a slight smile that revealed perfect white teeth. "I'm an excellent judge of character. You have the bearing of someone who takes pride in honest work, despite your current circumstances." Emma tugged on Margaret's skirt. "Mama, is the nice man going to help us?" Adrian knelt down to Emma's level, bringing his face into the lamplight. The child didn't flinch from his intense gaze. "What's your name, little one?" "Emma Sullivan, sir." "Emma is a beautiful name. Tell me, are you hungry?" Emma nodded solemnly. "We had bread yesterday, but it was very small." Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stood and turned back to Margaret. "The offer stands. Your children need warm beds and full stomachs. You need stability. I need someone trustworthy to manage my household." "This is too generous," Margaret protested. "What aren't you telling me? I'm a private man, Mrs. Sullivan. I value discretion above all else. My business often requires me to travel at unusual hours, sometimes for days at a time. I need someone who won't ask questions about my comings and goings." Adrian's eyes met hers. "Can you provide that?" Margaret looked down at her children. Thomas was trying not to shiver, putting on a brave face. While Emma's lips had turned blue from the cold, the decision wasn't really a choice at all. "When would we start?" she asked. "Tonight, if you wish. I have a carriage waiting around the corner." Adrian pocketed his wallet but kept the bills in his hand. "Consider this an advance on your first month's salary." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the money. Their fingers touched briefly, and she was startled by how cold his skin felt. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You don't know what this means to us." "I believe I do," Adrian said softly. "Desperation has a particular scent, Mrs. Sullivan. I'm intimately familiar with it." The carriage ride to Hillcrest Avenue passed in a blur of warm blankets and soft cushions. The children fell asleep almost immediately, their bodies finally relaxing after months of tension and cold. Margaret watched Adrian from across the carriage, trying to understand her good fortune. "You said you travel for business," she ventured. "What kind of work do you do?" "Import and export," Adrian replied without elaboration. "I deal primarily with European clients who prefer to conduct business during unconventional hours." Margaret didn't press further. She was too grateful and too tired to question the details. When the carriage turned through ornate iron gates and approached a sprawling Victorian mansion, she gasped audibly. "This is your home?" "Our home now," Adrian corrected. "The staff quarters are in the East Wing. You and the children will have a full suite of rooms overlooking the garden." The house was even more magnificent inside. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over polished marble floors, and oil paintings lined the walls. Margaret had never imagined such luxury existed, let alone that she would live within it. Mrs. Hensley, the elderly cook, appeared to greet them. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her kind eyes crinkled when she smiled at the children. Poor lambs looked half frozen. "Come along, I'll get some soup in ya," as Mrs. Teddy. Hensley led Emma and Thomas toward the kitchen. Adrian turned to Margaret. "Your room is up the main staircase, third door on the left. You'll find everything you need has been prepared." Margaret frowned. "Prepared? But you only met us an hour ago." Adrian's expression didn't change. "I'm very efficient, Mrs. Cotty. Sullivan. Rest well. We'll discuss your duties in the morning." Margaret's room was larger than the entire apartment she'd shared with her family. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, and thick Persian rugs covered the hardwood floors. The adjoining rooms for Emma and Thomas were equally luxurious, with toys and clothes already laid out in their exact sizes. As she tucked her children into their new beds, Emma looked up with wide eyes. "Mama, is Mr. Blackwood an angel?" Margaret kissed her daughter's forehead. "I don't know, sweetheart, but he's certainly been a blessing." That night, Margaret lay in her comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling. Everything had happened so quickly, so perfectly, that it felt almost like a dream. Adrian Blackwood had appeared exactly when she needed him most, offering exactly what she required. It was too convenient, too fortunate. She rose and walked to the window, looking out over the moonlit gardens. A figure moved across the lawn with impossible speed. There one moment and gone the next. Margaret blinked hard, certain her tired mind was playing tricks on her. In the distance, she heard what sounded like a wolf howling, though no wolves had been seen in these parts for decades. The sound sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Margaret returned to bed, pulling the covers over her head. Whatever questions she had about Adrian Blackwood could wait until morning. Tonight, her children were warm and fed and safe, and that was all that mattered. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Adrian's offer had changed more than just their living situation. Something fundamental had shifted, and there would be no going back to their old life. The last thing she remembered before unconsciousness claimed her was the image of Adrian's too pale skin and the way his eyes had seemed to glow in the lamplight. In her dreams, she heard his voice again. "Walk with me, Margaret Sullivan. Your journey is just beginning." Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through silk curtains and the sound of her children's laughter echoing from somewhere downstairs. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to see the cracked plaster ceiling of their old boarding house room. Instead, she found herself in luxury beyond her wildest dreams. After washing with the rose-scented soap provided and donning one of the simple but well-made dresses from the wardrobe, Margaret made her way downstairs. She followed the sound of voices to a bright breakfast room, where Emma and Thomas sat at a polished oak table, their faces glowing with health and happiness. "Mama!" Emma called out, running to embrace her. "Mrs. Hensley made pancakes with real butter and honey." Thomas, typically more reserved, simply smiled and waved from his chair. His plate was clean, evidence that he'd eaten his fill for the first time in months. Mrs. Hensley bustled over with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan. I hope you slept well. Mr. Blackwood asked me to see to the children's breakfast and to prepare a proper meal for you as well." "Where is Mr. Blackwood?" Margaret asked, looking around the sun-filled room. "Oh, he doesn't take his meals during the day," Mrs. Corelli asked. Hensley explained matter-of-factly. "He keeps very unusual hours, what with his business and all. You'll find him in his study around sunset, I expect." Margaret found this odd but decided not to question their benefactor's habits. After breakfast, Mrs. Hensley showed her through the house, explaining her duties. The work was extensive but manageable, and the elderly cook proved to be excellent company. "How long have you worked for Mr. Teddy?" "Blackwood?" Margaret asked as they toured the library, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. "Going on 15 years now, Mrs." Hensley replied, running a feather duster over an ornate clock. "He's been nothing but kind to me, though I'll admit he's particular about certain things." "What kind of things?" Mrs. Christ. Hensley paused in her cleaning. "Well, he's very specific about privacy. No visitors during daylight hours. No one is allowed in his private chambers on the top floor. And he has strict rules about the windows in certain rooms." Margaret noticed that several rooms did indeed have their windows covered with heavy black curtains, even during the brightest part of the day. "Is he ill? Sensitive to sunlight, perhaps?" "Something like that, Mrs. Hensley said evasively. "Best not to ask too many questions, dear. Mr. Blackwood values his privacy above all else. As long as you respect that, you'll find him a generous and fair employer." The days fell into a comfortable routine. Margaret managed the household efficiently. Her children attended the local school with new clothes and full lunch pails, and slowly the gaunt look of hunger faded from all their faces. Emma bloomed like a flower, making friends easily and bringing home artwork to display on her bedroom walls. Thomas, more cautious by nature, took longer to adjust, but gradually began to smile more often. Margaret saw little of Adrian during those first weeks. Sometimes she heard his footsteps on the stairs late at night, or caught glimpses of him through windows as he walked the gardens in the early hours before dawn. When they did encounter each other, he was unfailingly polite, but maintained a careful distance. It was during her third week at the estate that Margaret began to notice the peculiarities that Mrs. Hensley had only hinted at. Adrian never appeared before sunset, and she never saw him eat or drink anything. The room she'd been told was his study had no mirrors, something she discovered while dusting. Most strangely, the expensive wines in his cellar all bore dates from decades or even centuries past, far older than any wine should be able to remain drinkable. Her curiosity finally overcame her discretion one evening when she saw light coming from beneath the door of his forbidden chambers. She climbed the narrow stairs to the top floor, her heart pounding with each step. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see Adrian standing before a tall window, looking out at the full moon. He wore only a white shirt and dark trousers, and in the moonlight his skin appeared almost translucent. As Margaret watched, transfixed, Adrian turned his head sharply in her direction, as if he'd sensed her presence. "Come in, Margaret," he said without looking toward the door. "I've been expecting you." Margaret's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she pushed open the door. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I didn't mean to spy. I was just curious, Adrian finished, turning to face her. It's perfectly natural. You've shown remarkable restraint in not questioning me sooner. The room was unlike anything else in the house. Ancient tapestries hung on the walls, depicting scenes that looked medieval in origin. Candles provided the only light, their flames casting dancing shadows across furniture that appeared to be genuine antiques. Most notably, there wasn't a single mirror to be found. You have questions, Adrian said, moving to pour himself a glass of what looked like red wine from a crystal decanter. Ask them. Margaret gathered her courage. What are you, Mr. Blackwood? Adrian smiled, revealing those perfect white teeth she'd noticed that first night. In the candlelight, his canine teeth appeared longer than normal, sharper. What do you think I am, Margaret? Her logical mind rejected the answer that formed in her thoughts, but her instincts had known from the beginning. You're not human. Very good. Adrian set down his glass without drinking from it. I am what your kind calls a vampire, though that word carries so many misconceptions. Margaret felt her knees go weak. She gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. That's impossible. Vampires are just stories, legends. I assure you I am quite real. Adrian approached her slowly, his movements fluid and graceful. I have walked this earth for nearly 400 years, Margaret. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched plagues sweep across continents, witnessed the birth of the modern world. You're going to kill us, Margaret whispered, thinking of her children sleeping peacefully downstairs. Adrian's expression grew pained. Is that what you think? That I brought you here to harm you? He shook his head. Margaret, I could have drained you dry that first night if that had been my intention. I could have taken your children and left your body in an alley where no one would have found you for days. Margaret's breath came in short gasps. Then why? Why help us? Adrian walked back to the window, his reflection notably absent from the glass. I told you that first night that desperation has a particular scent. What I didn't tell you is that so does innocence, and goodness, and the fierce love of a mother for her children. He paused, his voice growing soft. I had forgotten such things existed until I encountered you. I don't understand. I feed on human blood, Margaret. That much of the legend is true. But I am not the monster that folklore would have you believe. Adrian turned back to her. I choose my prey carefully. I take only from those who deserve it, those who prey upon the innocent and helpless. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. They're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice, Adrian corrected. The corrupt businessman who steals from widows and orphans. The landlord who throws families into the street in winter. The factory owner who works children to death for profit. These are the men who feed me, Margaret. These are the monsters I hunt. Despite her fear, Margaret found herself thinking of her former landlord, of the mill supervisor who had docked her pay for being late when Emma was ill, of all the men who had looked at her with predatory eyes when they learned of her desperate circumstances. You kill evil men, she said slowly. I remove parasites from the world, Adrian replied, and I have done so for centuries. But it is a lonely existence, Margaret. I had forgotten what it meant to be near goodness, to witness the simple joy of children at play, to see a mother's love in action. Margaret struggled to process this information. So we're what, pets? Entertainment? Adrian's eyes flashed with something that might have been heard. You are a reminder of what I once fought to protect. Before I became this creature, I was a knight, sworn to defend the innocent. I lost my way somewhere along the centuries, became focused only on vengeance and feeding. You and your children have reminded me of my original purpose. And if I want to leave? If I take Emma and Thomas and walk out that door right now? Then I will give you enough money to start fresh anywhere you choose, Adrian said without hesitation. I will not hold you against your will, Margaret. That would make me no better than the monsters I hunt. Margaret sank into the chair she'd been gripping. Her mind reeled with the impossibility of the situation. I need time to think. Of course. Adrian moved to his desk and withdrew a key from the drawer. This opens the strongbox in my study. Inside, you'll find more than enough funds to support you and your children for years, should you decide to leave. Take it now, so you know you have that option. Margaret accepted the key with trembling fingers. Why are you trusting me with this? Because trust is the foundation of any relationship worth having, Adrian said simply. I have been alone for too long, Margaret. Your presence here, your children's laughter, even the simple sounds of daily life have awakened something in me that I thought was dead forever. Margaret stood on unsteady legs. I should go. The children will be wondering where I am. Margaret, Adrian called as she reached the door. Whatever you decide, know that meeting you and your children has been the greatest gift I have received in centuries. You have given me back a piece of my humanity. Margaret fled to her room, her heart pounding and her mind spinning. She checked on Emma and Thomas, both sleeping peacefully in their comfortable beds, then sat by her window staring out at the moonlit gardens. A vampire. Adrian Blackwood was a creature from nightmares, yet he had shown her and her children nothing but kindness. He claimed to hunt only evil men, to be some sort of supernatural vigilante. Could such a thing be possible? She thought of her husband David, who had been good and gentle and died too young while cruel men prospered. She thought of all the times she'd wished for justice in a world that seemed to favor the wicked over the innocent. If Adrian was telling the truth, he was that justice made manifest. But he was still a killer, still a creature that fed on human blood. Could she continue to live under his roof, to let her children call this place home, knowing what he truly was? Margaret clutched the strongbox key in her palm until its edges left marks on her skin. Tomorrow she would have to make a choice that would determine the rest of their lives. But tonight, she simply sat and watched the shadows move in the garden, wondering if the pale figure she occasionally glimpsed was friend or foe. One thing she knew for certain, their lives would never be simple again. Adrian Blackwood had saved them from poverty and starvation, but in doing so, he had drawn them into a world of darkness and secrets that she was only beginning to understand. The question now was whether she was brave enough to stay and discover what other mysteries lay hidden in the shadows of Hillcrest Avenue. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She paced her room until dawn, weighing her impossible situation. When morning came, she found a note slipped under her door, written in Adrian's elegant handwriting. Take all the time you need. Your position here is secure regardless of your decision. A.B. The kindness in those simple words somehow made her choice more difficult. A monster wouldn't be so considerate of her feelings, yet she had heard him admit to killing men, even if they were evil ones. 3 days passed before Margaret made her decision. During those days, she watched her children bloom in ways she had never thought possible. Emma's artwork covered the walls of the morning room, where she loved to paint by the large windows. Thomas had discovered Adrian's extensive library and spent hours reading books about history and science, his young mind hungry for knowledge that had been denied him in their former life. Mrs. Hensley noticed Margaret's distress but didn't pry, simply ensuring that meals appeared on schedule and that the house ran smoothly. The elderly cook's loyalty to Adrian was obvious, and Margaret found herself wondering what Mrs. Hensley truly knew about their employer's nature. On the fourth night, Margaret finally sought Adrian out in his study. She found him sitting before the fireplace reading a leather-bound book that looked centuries old. He looked up when she entered, closing the volume carefully. "Have you reached a decision?" he asked gently. Margaret took the chair across from him, noticing how the firelight seemed to barely touch his pale features. "I want to stay," she said, "but I have conditions." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. First, I want your word that you will never harm my children, no matter what happens between us." "You have it," Adrian said immediately. I would die permanently before allowing harm to come to Emma or Thomas. Second, I want to know when you hunt. I don't want details, but I need to know when you're going out on these expeditions so I can prepare the children if they ask where you are." Adrian nodded slowly. "That's reasonable. I typically hunt once or twice per month, usually traveling to other cities to avoid drawing attention to this area. And third," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger, "I want to understand what you do, not the act itself, but the why. If I'm going to live with the knowledge of what you are, I need to know that what you're doing serves some greater purpose than just feeding yourself." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Do you remember a man named Cornelius Blackthorne?" Margaret frowned. "The name sounds familiar. He owned several factories in the textile district. 6 months ago, he was found dead in his home, apparently of a heart attack." Margaret's eyes widened. "I read about that in the papers. Wasn't he the one who was found to have been stealing from the workers' pension fund?" "Among other crimes," Adrian confirmed, "he also had a habit of trapping young women in debt and then demanding payment in ways that had nothing to do with money. 3 girls took their own lives rather than submit to his demands." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. "You killed him." "I did. And I felt no more remorse than you would feel stepping on a cockroach." Adrian's eyes met hers. "His death was swift, Margaret. More merciful than he deserved, and far more merciful than he showed his victims." Despite herself, Margaret found she wasn't horrified by this revelation. Blackthorne had been a name whispered in fear among the factory workers, a man who crushed the desperate beneath his heel for sport. "How do you choose them?" she asked. "I listen. I observe. I read the newspapers and pay attention to the stories that don't make headlines." Adrian leaned forward. "I've had centuries to perfect my methods, Margaret. I know how to identify the true monsters among your kind." "Our kind," Margaret corrected quietly. "You may be different now, but you were human once." Something flickered across Adrian's features, an expression of pain so brief she almost missed it. "Sometimes I forget that," he admitted. "Thank you for the reminder." Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. "Mrs. Hensley knows what you are, doesn't she? She suspected for years before I finally confirmed it. Her late husband was one of the good ones, a factory foreman who tried to protect his workers from exploitation. He was killed by hired thugs when he threatened to expose unsafe conditions." Adrian's voice grew cold. "I hunted down every man responsible for his death. It took me 3 years, but I found them all. And Mrs. Hensley knows this. She helped me identify the last one. Said her herald would rest easier knowing justice had been done." Adrian stood and moved to join her at the window. "She's been like a mother to me ever since, strange as that may sound." Margaret could feel the cold radiating from Adrian's body as he stood beside her. "You really don't feel the cold, do you?" "I don't feel many things the way humans do," Adrian said softly. "Pain, temperature, fatigue, they're all distant concepts to me now. But watching your children play, hearing Emma sing while she paints, seeing Thomas discover a new book, those things reach me in ways I thought were lost forever." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I'll stay. We'll stay. But I want you to promise me something else. Anything. I want you to remember what it feels like to be near innocence and goodness. When you go hunting, I want you to carry that with you so you never forget why you do what you do." Adrian turned to study her face in the moonlight. "You're not afraid of me?" "I was," Margaret admitted, terrified actually. "But I've been thinking about all the truly frightening men I've encountered in my life, and none of them ever asked my permission for anything. None of them gave me choices or worried about my comfort. They took what they wanted without regard for the consequences. And I haven't done those things?" Margaret shook her head. "You've been kinder to me and my children than any human man has been since my husband died. That has to count for something." Adrian's hand moved as if he wanted to reach for her, then stopped. Margaret, there are things about my nature that you don't understand yet. I'm not capable of growing old with you, of being the kind of companion you might want someday. My existence is eternal, unchanging. I'm not asking you to be my husband, Adrian, Margaret said, though she felt her cheeks warm at the implication. I'm asking you to be our friend, to let us be part of your life for as long as it makes sense for all of us. And when the children grow up and want lives of their own, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Margaret said practically. Emma and Thomas deserve a childhood free from hunger and fear. If you can give them that, then whatever else you are doesn't matter to me. Adrian was quiet for so long that Margaret began to worry she had said something wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I have been alone for so very long, he whispered. I had forgotten what it meant to have a family, even an unconventional one. You're not alone anymore, Margaret said firmly. We're here and we're staying. You saved us from freezing on that street corner, Adrian. Now let us save you from your solitude. From that night forward, their lives settled into a new rhythm. Adrian began joining them for late dinners, arriving just as the children were finishing their homework. He helped Thomas with his mathematics and listened to Emma's stories about school with genuine interest. He never ate the food, claiming he preferred to dine later, but his presence at their table made them feel like a real family. Margaret learned to recognize the signs that indicated Adrian was preparing to hunt. He would become withdrawn, spending more time in his study reading old newspapers and making notes. When he announced he would be traveling on business, she simply nodded and made sure the children understood he would return in a few days. She never asked for details about his expeditions, but she began to notice patterns in the newspapers. A corrupt politician found dead of an apparent stroke. A loan shark discovered in an alley with no obvious cause of death. A judge known for taking bribes who simply vanished one night, his body never found. Each time, Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions. Revulsion at the taking of life, but also a grim satisfaction that true monsters were being removed from the world. She began to understand why Mrs. Hensley had stayed all these years, why she looked at Adrian with the fondness of a mother rather than the fear of a servant. The seasons changed, and with them the children grew and flourished. Emma developed a talent for music as well as art, and Adrian surprised them all by producing an antique piano from storage and having it tuned for her. Thomas discovered a passion for history, particularly the medieval period, and spent hours discussing battles and political intrigue with Adrian, who spoke of these events as if he had witnessed them firsthand. It was during one of these conversations that Thomas asked the question Margaret had been dreading. Mr. Blackwood, you seem to know so much about the Crusades. Almost like you were there. Adrian and Margaret's eyes met across the dinner table. Emma was absorbed in her drawing and didn't look up. But Thomas was watching Adrian with the intense curiosity of a bright 10-year-old who had noticed something unusual. History is a passion of mine, Adrian said carefully. I've made extensive studies of various time periods. Thomas accepted this answer, but Margaret could see the wheels turning in his young mind. How long before he began asking more pointed questions? How long before he noticed that Adrian never aged, never appeared in daylight, never seemed to eat or drink? That night, after the children were in bed, Margaret brought her concerns to Adrian. They're going to figure it out eventually, she said, as they sat in his study. Thomas especially. He's too observant, too intelligent. I know, Adrian replied. I've been thinking the same thing. What do we do when that happens? Adrian was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. We tell them the truth, he said finally, but not yet. Let them have a few more years of innocence first. Margaret nodded, understanding his reasoning. Emma was still just a child who believed in fairy tales. Thomas was old enough to ask questions, but young enough to accept simple answers. They had time before the full weight of their situation would need to be addressed. Adrian, Margaret said softly, do you ever regret saving us that night, bringing us into your world? Adrian turned to look at her, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight. Regret it? Margaret, saving you and your children is the best thing I've done in 4 centuries of existence. You've given me back my purpose, my connection to humanity. I should be asking if you regret accepting my offer. Margaret smiled. Never. You gave us life when we were dying. Everything else we can figure out as we go. As if summoned by their words, Emma appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes. Mama, I had a bad dream. Margaret rose to comfort her daughter, but Emma surprised them both by walking directly to Adrian and climbing onto his lap. The vampire went very still, unused to such casual physical contact. Mr. Blackwood, will you tell me a story? Emma asked, settling against his chest with the unconscious trust of a child who had never known anything but kindness from this mysterious man. Adrian's arms came up to hold her gently, and Margaret saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Pure, uncomplicated love. Whatever he had been before, whatever darkness lived within him, in this moment he was simply a man who adored the little girl in his arms. What kind of story would you like to hear? He asked softly. A story about a brave knight who protects people, Emma said with a yawn. Adrian's eyes met Margaret's over Emma's head, and she saw him smile. I know just the story, he said. Once upon a time there was a knight who had lost his way in the darkness. He thought he would never find the light again, until one cold night when he met a brave woman and her children who reminded him what he was supposed to be fighting for. Margaret listened as Adrian spun a tale of redemption and family, his voice soft and warm as he stroked Emma's hair. Thomas appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of storytelling, and curled up on the rug by the fire to listen, looking at her children safe and content, watching Adrian's face as he told his story. Margaret felt a peace she hadn't experienced since David's death. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a good life. They were a family, unconventional and complicated, but bound together by love and trust. When Adrian finished his story, both children were fast asleep. He carried Emma to her room while Margaret guided a drowsy Thomas, and they tucked them both into bed with the practiced efficiency of parents. Thank you, Margaret whispered as they stood in the hallway between the children's rooms. For what? For giving them stories to dream about instead of nightmares. Adrian cupped her face gently in his cold hands. Thank you for giving me a reason to believe in happy endings again. Outside, the moon cast silver light through the windows of Hillcrest Avenue, illuminating a house that held an unusual family bound together by circumstances that should have been impossible. A vampire who had rediscovered his humanity, a widow who had found strength in the most unlikely places, and 2 children who had learned that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. Margaret Sullivan had walked with the Vampire King that first cold night, not knowing where the path would lead. Now she knew that sometimes the journey matters more than the destination, and sometimes family is something you choose rather than something you're born into. In saving them, Adrian Blackwood had saved himself, and in accepting his nature, Margaret had discovered her own courage. Their story was far from over, but for now they had found peace in the shadows, and that was enough.